Okay, it is indeed a great pleasure to introduce to you Jonathan Kuttab, who is a jurist, a legal expert, and human rights lawyer activist, who also is the co-founder of the most important Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq, which enjoys special relationship with the UN bodies, but also with the Israeli occupation authorities. It is one of 6 crucial civic organizations recently banned by the Apartheid state, and is one of the foremost, thinker, that is Jonathan, in the region about the future of Palestine as the common country claimed by both Palestinians and Israelis. Jonathan's book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, is one of the most important documents ever written about solutions to the settler colonial conflict in Palestine. And the most readable one, I would say, and buy it today or download it, as we have explained in the chat. Now, I will read to you a short quote from the book because I think it sums up beautifully what Jonathan is trying to do. This is about midpoint in the book when he starts to talking about details of the political solution. He says, "This has been an intellectual exercise in determining if it is possible to map out a vision of a solution that addresses the most basic needs of both communities. It requires a radical rethinking of the ideologies governing both sides. As such, it is clear there will be those on both sides, not to mention numerous actors from outside the area, who will oppose this vision and work to prevent it from gaining any legitimacy or acceptance. I am not concerned here with those who insist on negating the other and who will not be satisfied with any solution that does not allow them to dominate or negate the other group. I am more concerned with those genuinely seeking peace and reconciliation who still find this vision objectionable." Now, Jonathan's sensitivity to issues, which has a crucial importance to both communities, is extraordinary and gives his suggested solution its potency and realistic chances of success. It so happens that it is aligned most intimately with the principles and actions dear to JNP and the One Democratic State groups. As a member of both groups, I'm extremely happy to welcome Jonathan to this webinar, which I'm sure will affect the thinking of every single one of us. Dear Jonathan, we are all eager to hear what you say about the solution to the Palestine colonial project.
Well, thank you very much for your very kind words. I don't know how, whether they are really well-deserved or not. But this has been a very interesting exercise for me. And I think those who will read the book will agree that it is a new way of looking at things. Not totally new. I mean, people have been talking about a one-state solution, secular democratic state, binational state, whatever, for many years. What I did in this particular book is something new and something different. I totally avoided most of the usual discussions about apartheid, settler colonialism, the legitimacy, the history, the religious claims of either side. Not to suggest for a second that there is any symmetry or equality between the two sides. I'm just looking at what is today. And I find that there are these two ideologies. One of them that wants to have a Jewish state, as Jewish as France is French. Now, that's the essence of Zionism. There are different shades in it, but that's the basic idea, that this land is for the Jews. God gave it to us, history gave it to us, Balfour gave it to us, we desperately need it, we fought and we have it, whatever. This should be as Jewish as France is French. And on the other side is another ideology of Palestinian nationalism, which says, Palestine Arabiya, Palestine is Arab. It's always been that way. It was sat upon by these foreigners. We don't know who they are. They're coming from all over the world. They're taking our land. This is an Arab land, part of the Arab world. We are nationalists. It should be Arab. And without, again, creating any symmetry or equality between these two ideas, I argue that both ideologies have failed and cannot succeed. And that to have any semblance of possibility of a solution, we need a radical rethinking of these two ideologies. Now, I acknowledge that the two-state solution for many times, for a long time, was the proposed solution. Let's go by the 67 borders, plus or minus. One of them will be a Jewish state, one of them will be a Palestinian Arab state. And I have to admit, I was one of those who worked very hard to try and achieve such a pragmatic solution with all its problems and drawbacks. But I argue in this book that that is no longer a possible solution, that the facts on the ground have been so radically changed by the settler enterprise at every level. In terms of numbers, you have about 700,000, more than 700,000 Jewish settlers. In terms of the location of the settlements, it's really spread out. They're not really bunched into blocks. They really are spread throughout the occupied territories. An entire infrastructure, physical as well as administrative, as well as legal, as well as psychological infrastructure has been created that many people now call just apartheid. Very simply, it's special privileges for Jews at the expenses of non-Jews. And the other side has really, in many ways, succeeded in fragmenting the Palestinian people into different portions to which different rules apply, whether you're in the Galilee or in East Jerusalem or in Gaza or in the West Bank, area A or B or C, or whether you're in the diaspora. For each group, there is a separate system of governance with rules, with rights, with procedures. And I'm saying that despite every possible advantage, Zionism has failed. Fully half the people living in historic Palestine today are not Jews, pure and simple. And I would argue also that Palestinian Arab nationalism has failed because fully half the people living in historic Palestine today are not Arab. And they're going nowhere. Neither group is going anywhere. And the idea of physically dividing the land into an Arab and a Jewish land has simply failed. The egg has been scrambled so much that it cannot be unscrambled. So I say, where does that leave us? Is there a vision? Is there a possibility of satisfying the needs of both sides without negating the other? the proposal of the book is that, yes, you can. You can. You can imagine, envision a solution that grants those who are living there, Jew or Arab, or those who want to live there, again, Jew or Arab, everything that they can aspire for except for exclusivity. You can have a state that is Jewish, however you define that. You can have a place of refuge. You can have a place of security and safety. You can have a place for vibrant Jewish life. In fact, you can have a Jewish state, which is not exclusively Jewish. That's both Jewish and Arab. And if you're a Palestinian, you can have an Arab-Palestinian state where you can exercise your full national rights and identity and culture and creativity in a state that is Arab, but not exclusively Arab. It's both Arab and Jewish. At first glance, you might think, this is crazy. How can you do that? And then I get into the details. And I delve into the details with some expansion and some details. And I say, first of all, you have to get rid of this notion of 51% determines everything. You can't do that. That's not democracy. I call this the false view of democracy, as well as the demographic demon. If 51% determines everything and can negate or demonize or delegitimize or disenfranchise or totally rule out the other group, then that's not democracy. That's something else. But if you have a structure that embraces, welcomes, and allows to thrive both groups, you can have a new structure that is richer and more fulfilling and more satisfying than either an exclusively Jewish state or an exclusively Arab Palestinian state. So I play around with this concept, and lo and behold, I think it can work. And I think it can be better for Jewish Israelis and for Palestinian Arabs than an exclusive state for either one. And I am so pleased to have such an intelligent audience. The few names that I recognize there are really very impressive. And I want them to tell me, am I off? Am I totally wrong? Is there something that can be done to improve this idea? Can I, in fact, offer sufficient guarantees, structural and procedural, to ensure that this vision can in fact be realized? What are the obstacles? And ultimately, how do we get there from here? I know I have a very small chapter on that issue because initially I did not want to include it in the book. It was, as I said, an intellectual exercise that I wanted to set up the vision. But the first thing everybody says, well, how do we achieve it? So I had to say a few words about how do we move towards achieving such a wonderful vision. How do we realize it? But certainly the first step is we have to abandon this mirage of a two-state solution. Today, the two-state solution actually serves to entrench and keep an unacceptable situation. Just you wait, you'll get your rights in a Palestinian state that somehow, somewhere, sometime will come about. If only the right elections in Israel bring forth the right people, if only we can find a Palestinian leadership that is both willing and able to move it forward, if only the United States will exercise more pressure or the international community will wake up and start exercising pressure, then we will realize the two-state solution. So first of all, we have to abandon that mirage. It is not happening. The only people today who call for a two-state solution are those who are benefiting from the status quo, who realize it's not going to happen, but that it's a wonderful alibi to prevent them from really doing the kind of creative, radical, soul-searching that is absolutely required to be done. And I realized this about 5 years ago when I met Thomas Dine. I don't know if you know him. For about 20 years, he was Mr. AIPAC. And I met him at some kind of function, and I said, Mr. Dine, can you tell me what's the position of AIPAC these days? Before my sentence was completed, he said, two states. Two states. So AIPAC now favors the two-state solution, supposedly, because they know it's not going to happen, but it's a wonderful alibi. Once you tell them, there's no two-state solution. A Canadian friend of mine, again, about 10 years ago, said what he would do with his Zionist friends or their supporters is say, congratulations, guys, you won. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. Now what? Now what? And the answer is, the only possible answer is apartheid. Apartheid. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. There's going to be apartheid now and forever. Now, if that's not acceptable to you, then what is the solution? What is it that you are proposing? If we are no longer trying for a small, tiny, truncated state in the West Bank and Gaza, maybe, with maybe some kind of bridge or, I don't know, tunnel between them, if that's no longer possible, then what? And it's very interesting because precisely at this juncture, the issue of the larger Palestine comes into play. What is happening now in the Galilee, in the Negev, in Sheikh Jarrah, is the exact same thing that's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the answer has to be something different than the current paradigm because it's no longer doable. So this is my suggestion. I don't know if I need to summarize what I think it is. Basically, it starts with saying, what are the basic requirements of each group? What does Zionism promise to the Jews? And what does Palestinian nationalism promise to us Arabs? And can I achieve all these things outside of the paradigm of Zionism versus Palestinian Arab nationalism? I tell the story about a rabbi that I met, and I said, look, Rabbi, I know you are a Zionist. You want a Jewish state. What's a Jewish state to you? What is it? I mean, you can't circumcise a piece of rock. What's a Jewish state? And he thought and thought, and then he told me, I want a state where any Jew, anywhere, no questions asked, can go and live as of right and be able to defend himself. I said, well, maybe I can give you something better. How about a state where any Jew, anywhere, no questions asked, can go and live as of right, where he doesn't need to defend himself because nobody's out to get him, because he is accepted, but not accepted exclusively. He is there, and it's his home, and it's his state, but it's at the same time the state of the Palestinian Arab. Can we have such a state? I think we can. It is certainly a vision worth struggling for and worth working for. So I'm not going to take any more time because I'm actually more eager to see the interaction and to hear your questions and your comments and your discussion. And I welcome hostile questions. I know the organizers do not like hostile questions. I welcome them. I would like to know, what is it that people have against such a vision or such a program or such a possibility?
Thank you very, very much for an great and moving presentation. And before I open it to questions, I want to use my prerogative unfairly and ask you a couple of questions that will clarify to those who have not yet read the book. I'm sure everyone will read the book after this. What it is that you are suggesting and why it is a safe bet for both sides. Now, some of the features in your program are very interesting and unexpected, may I say. For example, you do, some would say, bend backwards to satisfy the fears of Jews, which you admit are justified after the Holocaust, especially the fears of destruction and lacking in personal safety. You suggest that the army of the combined state should be commanded always, I think is the word, by a Jew, that the head of the Air Force will always be a Jew, that the head of the Navy should always be a Jew, if I remember correctly, and the head of the army should be a Jew, and actually the head of the police should be a Palestinian.
Yes.
And the deputies will be Jewish and Palestinian accordingly, yeah? Could you explain,
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people that find this an odd idea, and it reminds us of the Lebanon structure, which is, of course, come to grief many times.
Okay.
Is this what you have in mind? And
let me clarify. I did say that I want the defense minister as well as the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and nuclear position to always be a Jew with an Arab deputy, and every other position in the army to be on the basis of merit. And those who do not wish to fight can provide national service instead. But I want the head of the police force to always be a Palestinian Arab. And this addresses, I think, the historical trauma of both people. But I also provided something else. I also provided that 10% of the entire defense budget will always go to a special department that works on eliminating the hatred, the bitterness, the ignorance, the misunderstanding of the language, culture, and history of both groups. Because, and now I will address Israeli Jews or their supporters, and I say the biggest threat to you doesn't come from Iran or Turkey or Iraq or the Arab world or the outside world at all. The biggest threat to you comes from a 12-year-old schoolgirl who has a pair of sharp scissors in her pocket and she wants to stab somebody. And she doesn't care whether that helps or doesn't help her cause. She's full of bitterness, she's full of hatred, she's full of anger, she's full of resentment. That's the biggest threat to the Israeli Jew today. Is not some big, and you cannot address that by having more weapons and by having more destructive weapons and by having another squadron of F-36s or whatever it is. It doesn't help. You must address people's feeling of injustice and bitterness. That's how you arrive at security. At the same time, for the Palestinians, what we have suffered has not been at the hands of regular armies. Sometimes it has been, but they were actually exercising police functions. They were coming into our homes, coming into a civilian population, arresting in the middle of the night, bringing us before military courts instead of regular courts, with a local shin bet that governs all aspects of our life. Police functions are what we have suffered from. So if we have the head of the police being permanently, constitutionally, a Palestinian Arab, with a Jewish deputy, it will go a long ways to addressing those historical fears that we have. And again, the Lebanon example is not really very helpful here, because obviously at the time it made some sense, but now it doesn't make any sense at all. So I deal with the whole issue of, are there any precedents? Are we following the Lebanese precedent or not? I deal with that issue in my book. And the idea here is that there is something of a collective trauma, which I call the Holocaust syndrome, which is a huge thing. And it is not cured by giving more weapons and power to the Jewish people. You need to go beyond that, and you need to address a deeper thing. I'm not sure how that healing is going to take place. The post-traumatic syndrome, which I call the Holocaust syndrome, is not cured by giving more weapons and more destructive weapons and greater deterrence to the Israeli forces. It must be handled in different ways. But at least I recognize that it's true and it's there. I know for most Palestinians, it doesn't make sense. What do you mean security? What are you talking about security? You're the 4th, 5th largest army in the world. You have nuclear weapons, for God's sake. You have full control over everything. We have nothing. We have nothing. We have these stupid rockets that are more like firecrackers that are counterproductive in any way. We don't have an air force. We don't have a tank force. We don't have a regular army. We don't have discipline. We don't have lines of communication. We don't have training. We don't have any of these things. And you're telling us that you're worried about security? What about us? We have nothing. We're the ones who have. So I know that to even address Israel's security needs is radical for a Palestinian Arab, because we really don't think that Israel has a security problem. We think we have a security problem. We are the ones who are being set upon daily by the entire Israeli army and its mechanism, as well as by armed settlers who are acting with impunity and who are killing 1 or 2 of us every week, if not more, on a regular basis.
Can I just ask the last question before I open it to the audience, because I think they're dying to ask you even more difficult questions. How do you deal with, in your plan, I know the answer, but the audience probably doesn't, with the fact that democracy is not, as you said, 51%, but that the whole population feels that it is represented properly by the systems that the state allows and enables. So how do you actually deal with the fact that there are such people, we know them, especially on the Israeli side, who are likely to fight this tooth and nail, not to talk, as you said, about other actors outside of Israel, but those Israelis who are not democratic, they may even be a majority of them, we don't know. Some of the Pew reports point to a possible majority of Israelis being undemocratic? How do you deal with the fact that they will have freedom to have a party which is acting against everything that you suggested?
Well, the answer, of course, is a constitution. And the understanding of a constitution is something new because Israel doesn't have a constitution. And most of the Arabs have experience with constitutions that can be changed by a whim of the ruler, or that are changed very easily and very quickly. A constitution is a basic document that is over and above the regular laws that can change from time to time. So democracy gives every one person one vote. They create a Knesset or a parliament, and the parliament passes laws. But the laws have to be subject to this overarching, overriding constitution, so that a law or a regulation or a practice of the government or of a majority that contradicts the constitution is labeled unconstitutional and null and void. Now, the constitution will enshrine the principle of equality and non-discrimination in the public sphere. It will enshrine certain protections for each group, regardless of whether it continues or doesn't continue to have a majority. It implants, it hardwires into the democratic system certain guarantees that will work even when you are no longer the majority and you become 40% rather than 51% of the population. So it's a hybrid form of government. It is both democratic, but it also has a constitution that safeguards the rights of a minority and the rights of the individual, which is equally important. And certain rights for the international community, I think, who want to have access to the holy places, etc. So there are certain things that need to be guaranteed that cannot be left to the whim of a particular election or a particular group or a particular party or a particular ruler. Like we had Donald Trump in the United States wreaked havoc on the democratic systems in the United States and barely managed to be controlled through certain institutional safeguards, which didn't work very well, but in the end, they did work, and he was no longer able to exercise full authority. So a constitution is one of the important guarantees. There are others as well.
Thank you. And I think we're now ready for the onslaught of questions. I ask you, those who want to switch your cameras on and remain muted, indicating by raising your electronic yellow hand in the reactions menu at the bottom. Please find that and raise your hand so that I can invite you in the order that you indicate to ask your questions. Please start indicating, if you will. Galit Khazan Rokem, welcome. Would you like to ask your question? Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Jonathan Kuttab. I think your vision is beautiful. I'm still one of those who are afraid enough, not afraid personally, but who don't trust the subjects involved, the political subjects involved, to be able to bear up this beautiful vision and thus resort to the solution of two-state solution as the most just available in the conditions that we live in. But I have three questions to you since I haven't read the book yet. First of all, how do you deal with the question of the rights of the diasporas, the two diasporas, or maybe there are more? And I would ask, who is a Palestinian in parallel to who is a Jew? How many generations back will you go? How do you define that? That's one question. The other question would be the question of language, which I understand that you would say everybody has to know a little of the other language would be a good solution. And the third question is, you mentioned the heads of army, police, etc. You didn't, oh, it wasn't mentioned, it's probably in your book. Who would be the head of the secret services? Because I think that's a difficult question in the relationship between the two groups. So thank you for very, very much for a beautiful presentation. And thank you, Chaim Bresheeth, for organizing this. I'm grateful. And whoever organized it, it was really enlightening. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
In short order, right of return will be guaranteed both to Jews and to Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs are defined as the United Nations UNRWA defines them as residents of Palestine in 1948, as well as their descendants. You don't lose that by going back 1 or 2 or 3 generations back. Those who go up more than that generations are probably already dead. And not all Palestinians will want to return anyway, just like not all Jews will want to go to and live in Palestine. But for Jews, Zionism promises under the law of return, any Jew can return. So I'd say any Palestinian Arab can return. Not the Egyptian, not the Syrian, not the Jordanian, not the Iraqi, but the Palestinians, those whose father, grandfather, whose ancestors come from Palestine, those who left in 1948 and their descendants. That is a simple one. The language, I think you indicated, is easy. We can have both languages be official languages. You can use both languages. We can have interpreters, we can have signs, we can have, it's very easy because I think that is an easy one. And certainly you would want to learn the language of the other. If I were in Canada, I would want to know some French. I would not be satisfied with just English. Secret Service, I did not address this, but I suspect that just like in the United States, you have the FBI and the CIA, you can also have Secret Service internally as well as Secret Service for external purposes. You can still have the Mossad under headed by a Jew with an Arab deputy, and the local Shin Bet headed by an Arab with a Jewish deputy. That's an easy one.
I think on this point exactly,
I love your optimism, Jonathan.
I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I have a good dose of hope. Optimistic means I'm expecting things to be changed very soon, and I am not expecting things to be changed very soon, but I am full of hope.
The same issue comes up in Ronit Lentin's point. Ronit, would you like to unmute and make your point about the Secret Service?
Well, very, very briefly, reacting to Galit's issue, I think a truly democratic state does not need a secret service. The secret services are, in Israel, they are an arm of oppression and segregation and apartheid. And they are not only that, Israel, as it stands at the moment, sells security equipment, security systems, security training, armaments to the whole world. A state, as Jonathan envisions, should be a different type of state. A state does not require a strong army. A state does not require secret services, and certainly a state that does not make a fortune on exporting weapons and security systems.
I think that is absolutely true. I think it is amazing that a state which was supposed to be a light unto the nations has turned out to be one of the biggest, I think it's what, number 9 in selling weapons actually. And when it comes to secret services, Pegasus and the like, as well as killer drones, it's probably number 3 in the world. Yes, I do not. I would aspire for my state. If I were Jew, I would aspire for my state to be a light of enlightenment, of books, of new ideas, but not of military technology. You're right. But I don't think we can start by saying we don't want an army and we don't want a secret service. I myself am a pacifist. I don't want an army. I don't. That's why I want to safeguard the right of those who do not wish to kill and who do not wish to participate in violence at all. But I think most states in the world still require and demand, hopefully, a monopoly on the use of violence in order to maintain law and order.
I just want to also add, if I may, that in Palestine, whatever the one state will be called, we are talking about an Israeli prime minister that was killed by an Israeli Jew. Let us not forget. So if not for any other reason, we need for a while, and I suspect a long while, a secret service, a police, and an army to defend us from racist and people supporting apartheid, if nobody else, yeah? Because we know what happens when this is not watched. Una, would you unmute and ask your question? Unmute.
How do I? Can't I unmute?
Yeah.
Can you,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Jonathan, first of all, wow, respect to you, man. I love your vision, but I'm afraid I cannot, I wish I want that vision, but talk to the government of Israel and ask them what they think of it. They do not want Palestine to survive, end of. As we are talking now, there are people, settlers, and they all, sorry, the settlers are not the intellectual. There are people coming from, I was told by a Jewish person, they are released from jail, from Israel jail, to go and create havoc, like they did in a mosque last week. Now, do you call that a country who wants peace? Israel doesn't want peace, end of. They have an agenda. They want Palestine for themselves.
But what is your question to
my question
Jonathan?
is, yes, my question was, Jonathan, your view is wonderful, but do you think the government of Israel will like a Palestine to be alive? That's my question to you.
No, obviously not. I think it's it is very clear. Those who own slaves don't want to end slavery. Those who benefit from apartheid don't want to end apartheid. Those who are colonial rules don't want decolonization.
Yeah.
I think that's a given. We need to struggle. Those people who have privilege are scared of the word equality because equality to them sounds oppressive. You're taking away my privileges, my rights. If you want to end slavery, you're taking away my property, which I own.
So your views.
Sorry. I think you have had your questions. I think we also should remember that in South Africa, for example, it was seemingly impossible for a Black person to become a president at one point, and it happened. And it happened very beautifully. Can I ask Blake Olcott to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Chaim. Thank you, Jonathan. Very great vision, of course, the one democratic state. But Jonathan, you mentioned a couple of times that you were trying to avoid, I think you said, symmetry or equality between the two sides. Now, did you mean that philosophically or ethically? Because it seems that your vision is doing exactly that. You are treating both groups, assuming there are only two, exactly equally with symmetry. Thank you.
I am not. What I said was I am not. I don't want to get into an argument with those who will insist on the absolute lack of symmetry. I agree with them. There is no symmetry between an oppressor and an oppressed, between the slave owner and the slave, between the settler colonial and the local population. But I don't want to enter into that kind of debate. Who is more indigenous? Who came there first? Who has more historical rights? I don't want to enter into that discussion. There's a place for it, and I can get into it some other time. Right now, I am faced with a reality that there are these two groups. One of them, I mean, they came from all over the world. Israel has the highest rate of skin cancer for a reason, because people there aren't used to the hot sun, very simply. So I'm not, but I don't want to get into that type of argument.
Okay.
I want to face the reality. The reality is that today there are these two groups making claims, regardless of the legitimacy of their claims, and without making any symmetry between them. They need to live together. They cannot eliminate each other. That has been shown to be the case. I think Palestinians have come to accept it. I'm not sure that most Israeli Jews have come to accept the fact that they cannot eliminate the Palestinians. Golda Meir thought that the old will die off and the young will forget. They will not know. They have not forgotten. They have not left, and they are not about to leave. And I think the situation has changed so dramatically. It is not possible for Israel now to eliminate Palestinians as a people. Physically, they cannot eliminate us. Maybe they will try some more ethnic cleansing. I suspect that they cannot physically remove hundreds of thousands, certainly not millions, without some kind of reaction from the rest of the world. They will try, but even if they remove 100,000 or 200,000, that will not solve the problem. And if they eliminate 500,000 by either killing or kicking them out, it'll be so cataclysmic. It's not the solution. So if they are not going to physically eliminate us, they have to deal with us. And they have to deal with us with 20th and 21st century values and principles, and which means equality. They cannot deal with us along the lines of apartheid. They have to provide us with equality. They have to provide us with some rights. How can they do that? The only way they can do that is through apartheid, by having a two-tier system, one for Jews and one for non-Jews. But apartheid today is a crime under international law. You cannot do it. You cannot sustain this situation. This is what I meant by saying that we have to find a solution. And yes, it's not absolute justice, but it provides a way that we can live. And it provides a way that we can deal with the settlers. Because in my book, I say, you can't have a solution that totally demonizes settlers and that doesn't recognize that, at least in Israeli and Zionist terms, they have just as much right to be there as the Jewish leftist liberal who's living in an Arab house in West Jerusalem or in Haifa or in Tel Aviv. So you have to find a solution for the settlers. You have to include also Hamas into the formula. You cannot totally ignore them in the discussion. So you have to bring everybody in, and you have to find a solution that addresses the needs of everyone without going into the legitimacy of their claims.
Before I let in Yaakov to ask his question, could you further clarify, because you, me, and many other people here are supporters of the one democratic state solution. In your estimation, Jonathan, how widely supported is the ODS solution in Palestine, treating Palestine as its two parts, and the occupied and the Green Line, and in Israel by Israelis? In other words, how do you estimate the chances of success in the two communities?
Among Israelis, there is the same resistance to a one democratic state that there is to any kind of solution that takes away their privilege. That's understood. Among Palestinians, the resistance mostly comes from those who think, sounds good, but we're not being offered that. All we're being offered is the two-state solution. And even that is not really being offered to us. So if we can't even get the two-state solution, how can we get the one-state solution? So it's not that people are opposed to it as much as they think it is harder to obtain, and therefore they want to try and get anything that's even a little bit rather than asking for the whole thing. And we have been told very clearly for the last 40 years, if you dare use the word secular democratic state, that means you want to eliminate the state of Israel. That means between you and Hitler, there is very, very little difference. You want to kill us all. So we have been specifically, forcibly prohibited from talking and thinking and dreaming and asking for a one-state solution, because we were told that's the equivalent of you're calling for genocide. You're calling for an elimination of the state of Israel, and therefore there is no discussion to be held with you. If you want to talk, you have to start by saying, I accept the two-state solution, I recognize the state of Israel, I renounce, denounce, whatever the words that are given, that were given to Arafat to literally read specifically on television to make him eligible for a discussion, for a dialogue. So for many years, that's what we were told. You can't talk one state. Now we're saying, what do you think of one state? We've been silenced for so long that we don't dare to talk one state for fear of being considered extremist and outside of polite discussion.
Thanks. Yaakov, please unmute and ask.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Jonathan, I mean, it's exciting, your vision. I apologize because I haven't read your book. I can tell you that having come to Israel as a Zionist as a teenager and having integrated in Israeli society, I basically changed my worldview when I joined Matzpen in 1964, I believe. And one of the basic things that we advocated for is for a secular, democratic, socialist state. Now, I understand that socialism is not particularly in the news these days, but in your vision, the issue of the old society as a capitalist society, how do we address that? I mean, because that's in technically, at least your vision, which I admire. I mean, the positivity of that and looking for a real solution. It still may not be. I want to hear from you. I mean, on that point.
All right. I did not spend much time addressing the economic aspects. I recognize that there will be inequalities that will take quite some time to ameliorate or to address. And I'm not looking for absolute justice. I'm looking for relative justice. I'm looking for accommodations. For example, I'm not insisting that you throw anybody out of their homes, including the settlers, but I am insisting that you provide for those who've lost their homes and lands, proper compensation, alternative housing, alternative land, out of the public domain. Because the public domain needs to continue to be equally shared by everybody. So that the Israel Lands Authority and the Jewish National Fund and the Hemnuta and all the land that is under their control will now be controlled by the state and will now be given in equal, fair shares to everybody. And obviously the first thing that has to go, just like in the past, absorbing the refugees was a high priority. So in this case, we'll be providing for absorbing the refugees as well as those who are in the country who have lost their homes and land out of this. So there has to be some kind of restitution, some kind of restitutive justice, but it will not be a utopia. I suspect that for the near future, even if Jews today become 40% of the population, they will continue to dominate certain sectors of the economy and of the life of the country. There's no question about that. That is the reality of the situation. So I'm not trying to create a utopia. I'm trying to create a little bit more just solution than what exists now. This is all the answer that I have at this point.
Could I just take this a bit further, because I'm also an ex-Matzpen member, and this worries me daily, if you want, because I also supported the end to apartheid for many years, and then met the reality that the end to apartheid wasn't an end to inequality. And millions of Blacks are extremely upset about the end to apartheid that did not bring them real equality in their own country. How do we make sure that we don't actually give the Palestinians a bad deal like the Blacks got in? This is, I think, a real worry.
Well, no matter what happens, Palestinians will have a bad deal because at one time they had the whole country and now they have to share it. So there will be a bad deal. We can try to ameliorate it. We can try to provide programs and institutions. There's a whole ministry that needs to go to absorbing and dealing with the incoming refugees. As I said, there has to be 10% of the defense budget going towards creating new programs that address the fact that Arabs for many years have been totally kept out of certain sectors of Israeli industry and economy and life. So there has to be programs to provide some kind of restitutive justice. But I recognize that it's an ongoing process. Even if my vision were implemented tomorrow, which is not about to, there's going to be a continuing battle for equality and for fairness and for a better society. We are not living in utopia. We are struggling towards a better and a more just society in all the countries of the world.
Thanks. April, would you please unmute and ask?
Hello. I love your hope, and it does seem to be fairly clear-sighted hope. But I remember reading from Mary Jawensky some years ago about her hope was through the young. Do you think that there is more hope amongst the young Israelis who are sick of defending themselves, who are sick of there being war around them? Do you think that they might be the source of hope, who might listen to your vision of an idea of a single state? Or do you think that they've been so indoctrinated that it's not going to work or anything like that?
I'm sorry to be the bringer of bad news, but among the young Israelis, they are more right-wing, more racist, more entitled, more anti-Arab than even their elders.
Oh dear.
Sorry. Not so among young Jews abroad. In the United States, for example, and I assume the same in England. You find the opposite. You find the opposite. You find that the young are more open, more radical, more democratic, more enlightened, less racist, less willing to accept a privileged position that the young in Israel want.
Yeah, well, maybe they'll bring hope.
Thanks. I see Blake wants to ask another question, and I will just ask you to unmute.
Yes, I would appreciate a few words on how to get there.
Actually, there is a long list of things that can be done to get there. Most of these things do not require that you buy in totally into this vision. The current situation is so bad that you can start moving in steps towards it. For example, you can ask settlers to be under the same law as Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. You're only asking for equality. You can ask for the elimination of administrative punishments, administrative detention, administrative house demolition. You make things subject to law rather than the discretion of individuals. You can eliminate military courts, period. Certainly for the juveniles. Eliminate midnight arrests. You can lift the siege of Gaza today. That will not affect your security, and it will not affect your ultimate ideology. You can begin negotiations with Hamas. Instead of criminalizing and demonizing civil society in the West Bank, start by decriminalizing membership in Hamas. Start recognizing Hamas as a political force. So I still, would oppose anybody who carries weapons and shoots guns, but I will talk to Hamas. I have to talk to Hamas. How can I not talk to a group that, at least for the time being, is ruling 2 million Palestinians?
How about BDS from the other side?
For sure. See, BDS, it's really interesting. Why does Israel hate BDS? 2 reasons. Number one, because it moves things from the sphere of polite discussion towards concrete action that has an actual effect on the ground, however minuscule that effect is. Number two, they demonize BDS because it raises the ethical and moral questions. Because even if it doesn't affect things economically, it raises the moral question. You guys are doing wrong, and we are going to boycott you, and we're going to sanction you, and we're going to divest from you until you start doing right. So Israel has put so much effort into fighting BDS. This same effort is also going to go into fighting the apartheid designation. That's gearing up. There's also another effort to change international law itself. Yes, Netanyahu said so. We don't like international law, we'll change it. Very simply. There is now a new definition, the IHRA definition of what anti-Semitism is, which is now being used to criminalize all support for Palestinian advocacy and for all opposition to anti-Semitism as being, anti-Zionism as being anti-Semitic and therefore criminal and therefore to be prosecuted. So that people who advocate for justice in Palestine are going to have to spend half their time defending themselves against bogus claims of anti-Semitism, which are being now written into the law of a number of countries. It's coming to England too, trust me. You have a battle for that IHRA definition. So advocacy for Palestine is going to be criminalized throughout the world. Because you see, maybe you don't understand this. You have to understand that the Zionists in Israel think that they've won. The battle is finished. There is nothing to talk about. They don't want to even hold talks with Abbas. With Abbas. So what's there to talk about? Whatever it is we want, we get. Even the Arab world, you know, you have to solve the Palestinian problem to have relations with the Arab world. Nah, we'll just offer them a few billions in arms and twist their arms and force them, and they will come to us. They will come to us. We have won. The hubris of the arrogance of the current regime in Israel is amazing. I mean, they've always been a bit arrogant, but the kind of arrogance that I see these days is unbelievable. And sorry, I have to use biblical and religious terms. Pride cometh before the fall. I think there is nothing as vulnerable as a state that believes it's all powerful, that can do anything and everything it wants. That it is no longer. It's not to be held by the same standards that everybody else is to be held by. That it is exceptional. And that also, by the way, applies to the United States. The feeling of utter arrogance and being above the law and being able to do whatever they want without having to listen to anybody or consider anybody else.
I just want to continue that line for a minute, because this is a very important line. Israel has just banned 6 organizations that protect Palestinian society, including the very important organization that you have founded, Al-Haq, which actually protects people legally against illegal regime. Isn't that also a sign of not just hubris, but actually a sign of stupidity, and the fact that they are not even allowing non-violent organizations that work within the law to operate? Isn't that a sign of weakness?
Yes, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that at some level, those who are wise in Israel, and we have seen, particularly people in the defense establishment in Israel, who are extremely worried that this path that they are following is ultimately self-destructive. That is not what you get from the politicians. And that's not what you get from those who want to appeal to the worst in all of us. But the professionals are, I think, extremely worried that things are not going the way it should be, and that real change has to take place. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Rise Up and Kill First. At the end of the book, a former head of the Mossad, on his last day in office, gave this lecture in which he said, we have failed because we have projected to our people such an image of success that they think they no longer have to make peace with the Arab world. And he says, this is dangerous. We absolutely, definitely need to make peace with our neighbors and with the Palestinian people. But we have succeeded in projecting an image that we can do anything and everything. And therefore, there is really no need to compromise with anybody. And at the end of this lecture that he gave in front of 200 journalists, one lady got up and said, I am the head of the censorship, the army censorship, and I hereby tell you everything you've heard in this lecture is secret and illegal, and you should not publish it. So this guy just shrugged and went to Tel Aviv University and issued the same lecture in front of 200 students to make sure that it actually got out into the public. But yeah, Israel now feels that they have won. They got everything they want. What more do they want? What more do they need? Why should they negotiate with anybody? And I think this is a very dangerous place to be.
We're coming to the end of the meeting. I'll ask Ronit to speak, and then if there is a last question following, I think we'll have to end there. Ronit?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think your vision is exciting, and I hope that something of it comes through, possibly not in my lifetime, perhaps in yours. But what I'd like to ask you, actually I listened yesterday to the ceremony of remembrance to fallen family members, the Palestinian and Israeli combined. And it was very encouraging because these are people who do come together and who do see the other. Because part of the problem is we Israelis were educated not to see you as human beings. But my question is different. In your list of things to do and how do you envision the new state, have you thought of other equalities that need to be implemented, such as gender equality, equality to LGBT people, equality to people with disabilities, equality to people racialized within each group? I mean, there are racialization within each group. Have you given some attention to these minorities?
Totally. What I said, without actually going into the details that you mentioned, is that a constitution provides protection not only for substantial minorities, but also for the individual against the abuse of the majority. So as individuals, these rights need to be protected. Equality needs to be extended to individuals, even if the majority does not feel that way. So the Constitution, in my scheme, is what provides protection for the minorities as well as for the individuals.
Jonathan, you seem to have answered an amazing range of questions, but I want to tell the audience that even you cannot do justice to the book in 15 or 60 minutes. And I want to urge you all to read the book very carefully. It is a beautiful vision. It is, more importantly than that, a vision that can actually happen. Because Jonathan has spent years thinking about all these questions that you asked and many more difficult questions that he's answering in the book, so that whoever reads it is unlikely, totally unlikely to remain with questions to ask. So this is a small price to pay to buy this book or to download it. Please invest the time. I promise you, you will be much surprised at the amazing insight and sensitivity that is therein. Yeah. So thank you again very much, not just for the book and for tonight, but for your work for many years in supporting the rights of the Palestinians and working towards a peaceful and just end to the colonial conflict in Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I just want to remind everyone here before I close the meeting officially, that within 4 days or so, on Sunday, this Sunday, there is the public launch of the Convivencia Alliance. If you don't know what I'm talking about, well, we've just been talking about for the last hour. That is what the Convivencia Alliance is about. It is about life in Palestine for Jews, Christians, and Muslims under a one democratic state. This is what it is about. And we are launching this in the P21 gallery on behalf of a number of organizations. We have very senior Palestinian figures, the head of ODS, a number of the archbishops in Jerusalem, academics, right and left. I don't mean right, but you know what I mean, you know, a range of academics, Palestinians, Israelis, others, artists, writers, authors, filmmakers, you name it, are supporting this. If you cannot actually come in person, it will be actually shared, streamed online, and also a recording will be there. If you want to know the very different mechanisms that Jonathan's great vision can be put into practice, please join us in the Convivencia Alliance this Sunday and following in the years to come. Thank you very much, especially to Jonathan. Please continue your excellent work. You are working on behalf of all of us.